Hey guys, tonight we step into a world of glittering palaces and whispered conspiracies, a realm of almost unimaginable wealth set against a backdrop of profound, earth-shattering change. You're drifting into the final opulent moments of Imperial Russia, a time when the Romanov dynasty, rulers for over 300 years, are about to face their ultimate tragic destiny. Imagine the rustle of silk gowns, the glint of diamonds in candlelight, the distant echoes of revolutionary fervor growing louder with each passing day. It's a story so intense, so pivotal, that you'll feel the chill of the Siberian winter and the heat of impending conflict right where you are. Honestly, navigating the complexities and heartbreaks of this era, you probably won't survive this with your composure entirely intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and post your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see our global history community. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the twilight of an empire, a vast sprawling domain stretching across a sixth of the Earth's landmass. It's the early 20th century, and the air itself seems to shimmer with a kind of gilded unreality. Your gaze sweeps across the immense Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's preferred residence. It's less overwhelmingly formal than the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, but still a world away from anything you, or I might call, cozy. Imagine sprawling parks, manicured gardens, and a private lake where imperial children once ice skated under a pale winter sun. Inside, you navigate long corridors, your footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Sunlight, when it breaks through the often gray Russian skies, refracts through crystal chandeliers, scattering rainbows across walls adorned with silk tapestries and family portraits. You can almost smell the beeswax polish on antique furniture, the faint perfume lingering in the air from the Tsarina's private chambers, perhaps a hint of the strong Russian tea that was a staple of daily life. The wealth is staggering, almost comical in its excess. Consider the Winter Palace, that grand green and white edifice in St. Petersburg. With over 1,000 rooms, you'd probably need a GPS and a packed lunch just to find a loo, let alone navigate its intricate social geography. Getting lost in there wouldn't just be embarrassing. You might miss a state dinner, which, given the culinary delights of the era for the upper crust, would be a tragedy in itself. This was a world where Fabergé's intricate jeweled masterpieces were exchanged as Easter gifts, each one a miniature testament to the dynasty's unimaginable riches and the artistry it could command. Yet, beneath this shimmering surface, you sense a profound unease. The whispers are there, in the rustle of servants' uniforms, and the sidelong glances exchanged between courtiers. The year 1913 marked a particularly dazzling moment, the Romanov centenary, celebrating 300 years of the dynasty's rule. Festivities were held across the empire, a grand display of imperial power and permanence. Churches held solemn services, military parades marched through city squares, and lavish balls were thrown, reaffirming the Tsar's divinely ordained authority. It was a spectacle meant to inspire awe and loyalty, and for many, it probably did. But for others, it was a garish reminder of the vast gulf between the ruling elite and the impoverished masses. Historians still argue whether the Romanov dynasty was already teetering on the brink of an inevitable collapse by this point, weighed down by centuries of autocratic tradition and an inability to adapt to the modernizing world, or if the cataclysm of the First World War was the true, unavoidable accelerant that set the empire ablaze. Certainly, the war, when it came in 1914, would stretch the nation's resources and its people's patience to the breaking point. But even before the first shots were fired, you can feel the ground is not entirely stable under your feet. There are tremors of discontent from the burgeoning industrial working class, from land-hungry peasants, and from intellectuals dreaming of a different Russia. Court life, for all its outward splendor, is a labyrinth of intricate etiquette and whispered intrigues. Imagine trying to keep track of who to bow to, how deeply, and in what order. One misplaced curtsy or an improperly addressed comment can cause a minor scandal. Or, heaven forbid, you might be seated next to someone frightfully dull at dinner for the rest of the season. The pressure to conform, to say the right thing, to wear the right clothes, must have been immense. It was a gilded cage in many respects, even for those at its very pinnacle. You see the young Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and the little Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the vast empire. They are often depicted in idyllic settings, dressed in white lace, seemingly untouched by the world's harsher realities. Yet their lives are already circumscribed by their imperial status, every public appearance managed, every friendship scrutinized. The Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna, a German princess by birth, is a particularly complex figure. You observe her profound religious devotion, her intense love for her family, especially for her son Alexei, who suffers from hemophilia, the royal disease. This illness, a secret closely guarded by the imperial family, casts a long shadow, a constant source of anxiety, and a vulnerability that would later be exploited by figures like Grigory Rasputin. Her reliance on this mystic Siberian peasant, believing he could heal her son, further alienates her from the Russian court and public, who view Rasputin with suspicion and disdain. They probably muttered that the only thing Rasputin was healing was his own bank account, though his influence was undeniably potent for a time. As you wander these opulent, yet increasingly isolated halls, you feel the chill of foreboding. The Romanovs are surrounded by symbols of their power, by the legacy of their ancestors, by the routines of a court that has operated in much the same way for generations. But outside the palace gates, the world is changing with breathtaking speed. The rumblings of discontent are growing louder, transforming into a roar that will soon be impossible to ignore. The imperial twilight is deepening, the shadows lengthening, and the stage is being set for one of history's most profound and devastating tragedies. The air, once filled with the scent of roses and expensive perfume, now seems to carry a faint metallic tang, the scent of approaching storm clouds, heavy with unshed tears and the promise of revolution. The jewels still sparkle, but their light seems colder now, more brittle, as if reflecting an impending icy dawn. The chill you felt in those grand, echoing halls settles more deeply as your focus narrows to the family at the very heart of this imperial drama, the Romanovs themselves. You observe Tsar Nicholas II, autocrat of all the Russias. He's not the imposing, iron-willed figure you might expect from such a title. Instead, you see a man of medium height with kind, somewhat melancholic blue eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. He possesses a quiet dignity, a deep love for his wife and children, and a genuine devotion to Russia, as he understands it. He's meticulous in his daily routines, a creature of habit. You can almost picture him at his desk, diligently writing in his diary. He dutifully note the weather, the number of birds he spotted on his walk, and which distant cousin twice removed came for tea, probably giving 5 stars to the cucumber sandwiches, while an empire was teetering on the brink of chaos. Talk about priorities. It's this disconnect, this preference for the minutiae of private life over the colossal challenges of governing, that many would later cite as his fatal flaw. He was never truly bred for the throne in the way some ruthless predecessors were. He inherited it unexpectedly after his father Alexander III's early death. One mainstream historical fact that casts a long, ominous shadow over his reign is the Kodinka tragedy. During his coronation festivities in Moscow in 1896, a crowd gathered for celebratory gifts and food, but a stampede ensued, leading to the deaths of over 1,000 people. Nicholas, advised to continue with the coronation ball that evening to avoid offending foreign dignitaries, did so, a decision that painted him as callous and out of touch from the very beginning, earning him the grim moniker Nicholas the Bloody among his detractors long before later events cemented it. Beside him, you see Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna, born Princess Alex of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. She is striking, with auburn hair and expressive eyes, but there's a palpable air of reserve about her. This shyness is often misinterpreted by the Russian court as hauteur or disdain. She carries herself with a regal bearing, yet you sense a deep-seated anxiety beneath the surface. Her conversion to Russian Orthodoxy was profound and sincere, and her faith became an all-consuming passion, sometimes bordering on mysticism. This spiritual intensity, coupled with her German birth, made her an object of suspicion and, during the war years, outright hostility. Her primary concern, the one that dictates so much of her world, is the health of her son, Alexei. And then there are the children, often referred to by the acronym OTMA, formed from the first letter of each of their names: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Sounds a bit like a new Scandinavian furniture brand, doesn't it? Get your OTMA bookshelf, now with extra imperial angst. But this collective name signified their closeness, a tight-knit unit often finding solace and companionship primarily within their own circle. They were, by most accounts, refreshingly unspoiled for imperial offspring, raised with a degree of simplicity insisted upon by Alexandra. They slept on camp cots, took cold baths, and were expected to occupy themselves with needlework or studies. You watch Olga, the eldest Grand Duchess. She is thoughtful, with a direct gaze. You see an intelligent young woman, fond of reading, sometimes prone to bouts of melancholy, perhaps sensing the precariousness of their world more acutely than her younger siblings. She possesses a strong sense of justice and isn't afraid to speak her mind, at least within the family. There's a certain wistfulness about her, as if she's already carrying a burden beyond her years. Tatiana, the second daughter, is the beauty of the family, elegant and poised. You observe her natural grace and a certain quiet authority. She's practical, organized, and deeply devoted to her mother, often acting as a gentle intermediary between Alexandra and the outside world, or even her other siblings. She seems to understand Alexandra's anxieties better than anyone, earning her the nickname the governess for her capable and responsible nature. If there was a crisis, you imagine Tatiana would be the one to calmly assess the situation and suggest a practical solution. Next is Maria, often described as the angel of the family. She's pretty with large, gentle eyes, Maria's saucers, as they were known. You see an inherent sweetness and good nature about her. She's physically strong, loves children, and possesses a simple, uncomplicated kindness. There are stories of her effortlessly lifting her tutors, or even her frail brother. While perhaps not as intellectually inclined as Olga or as sharp-witted as Anastasia, her warmth and affectionate personality make her a beloved figure within the family circle. She reportedly had a soft spot for soldiers and dreamed of marrying one and having a large family. And then there's Anastasia, the most famous of the sisters, largely due to the later myths and impostors. You see a bundle of energy, a mischievous spirit with a quick wit and a talent for mimicry. She's the family clown, always ready with a joke or an amusing observation, sometimes to the point of being a little too sharp. You can just imagine her putting a frog in a Grand Duke's soup or attempting to teach the royal parrots some rather unimperial phrases, if only she'd known how prophetic revolutionary slogans might become. Her irrepressible spirit is a source of amusement and occasional exasperation for the family. Finally, your gaze rests on Tsarevich Alexei, the longed-for son, the heir to the vast Russian Empire. He's a handsome boy, with his father's eyes and an often serious expression for one so young. But his life is a constant battle against hemophilia, a genetic condition passed down through Queen Victoria's line, which prevent his blood from clotting properly. Every bump, every fall, could trigger a life-threatening bleeding episode, causing excruciating pain and long periods of confinement. You sense the oppressive weight of this illness on the entire family. Alexandra is consumed by a desperate, almost frantic need to protect him, a vulnerability that led her to place immense faith in Grigory Rasputin, the controversial Siberian mystic who seemed to be the only one capable of easing Alexei's suffering. The children's lives, while privileged, are also remarkably insular. They spend most of their time at the Alexander Palace or on the Imperial yacht, the Standard, during summer cruises. Their interactions with the outside world are carefully managed. Historians still debate the extent to which Alexandra's political influence over Nicholas, particularly during World War I when he was at the front, and she relied heavily on Rasputin's counsel relayed in her letters, contributed directly to the monarchy's collapse. Her advice, often colored by Rasputin's manipulations and her own anxieties, frequently clashed with that of experienced ministers, further isolating the imperial couple from sensible governance. You see them not just as imperial figures, but as a family. Parents worried sick about their child, sisters sharing secrets and squabbles, a boy trying to have a normal childhood despite a debilitating illness. Their private world, full of personal affections and anxieties, stands in stark contrast to the immense impersonal forces gathering outside their palace walls. It's this human dimension, these individual lives caught in the maelstrom of history, that makes their stories so compelling and ultimately so devastating. The laughter of the Grand Duchesses, the quiet hum of their schoolroom, the hushed conversations about Alexei's health, these are the intimate sounds of a world about to be irrevocably silenced. As you turn from the intimate, gold-leafed confines of the Alexander Palace, stepping metaphorically out of its gates, the air changes. The delicate scent of hothouse flowers and expensive French perfume, which you imagined clinging to the Grand Duchess's gowns, is replaced by something far more raw and biting. It's the smell of coal smoke, of damp earth, of unwashed bodies, and the pervasive aroma of simmering cabbage soup, the staple diet for millions. The laughter of the imperial children, sheltered as they were, remember those camp cots and cold baths, their version of roughing it, fades, and instead, you hear the distant rhythmic clang of factory machinery, the shouts of street vendors, and a low, persistent murmur of discontent, like the rumble of a gathering avalanche. These are the seeds of revolution, and you find them sprouting in every corner of the vast, troubled Russian Empire. You journey first to the countryside, where the overwhelming majority of Russia's population still lives. Here, the emancipation of serfs in 1861, a supposed landmark reform, feels like a distant, half-kept promise. Peasants are technically free, but they are shackled by debt, by a crushing lack of land, and by primitive agricultural methods. You see families crammed into small, often smoky wooden huts, their lives dictated by the seasons and the whims of nature, punctuated by periodic famines that sweep through the land with horrifying regularity. Education is a luxury few can afford, and for many, the Tsar is still a distant, almost mythical figure, the little father, though that image is about to be brutally shattered for many. Their longing is simple, yet profound: more land. It's a cry that grows louder with each passing year. Then you shift your gaze to the rapidly growing cities, Petersburg, Moscow, Odessa. Here, a new class is being forged in the crucible of industrialization. Factories, often financed by foreign capital, churn out textiles, steel, and armaments. But the human cost is immense. You walk through the workers' districts, grim warrens of overcrowded tenements where families live in single rooms, sometimes sharing beds and shifts. The working day is brutally long, often 12 to 14 hours, the pay meager and conditions dangerous. There's no safety net, no job security, no real recourse against exploitative bosses. It's in these grimy, desperate conditions that new radical ideas are taking root. Secret meetings are held in hushed tones. Pamphlets printed on clandestine presses are passed from hand to hand, filled with the revolutionary theories of Karl Marx and his disciples, promising a world where the workers, the proletariat, will rise up and claim their own. Trying to keep track of all the different socialist factions springing up: Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, Bundists, Trudoviks. It's like trying to choose a new streaming service subscription, except the wrong choice here might lead to a one-way ticket to Siberia rather than just a few hours wasted on a terrible rom-com. The Tsar's government, meanwhile, seems to stumble from one crisis to another. You witness the shock and humiliation of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. A supposedly mighty European power defeated by an up-and-coming Asian nation. It's a devastating blow to national pride and exposes the incompetence and corruption festering within the military and bureaucratic structures. This defeat fans the flames of domestic unrest, culminating in the seismic event of January 1905, Bloody Sunday. You see a procession of unarmed workers, led by a priest, Father Gapon, marching peacefully towards the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, intending to present a petition to their Tsar. Their banners bear images of Nicholas II, and they sing hymns. But Imperial troops open fire, and the snow-covered square runs red with blood. Hundreds are killed or wounded. The cherished image of the Tsar as a benevolent protector of his people is shattered, replaced by an image of a ruler who meets his subjects' pleas with bullets. This sparks the 1905 revolution, a year of strikes, peasant revolts, naval mutinies like the famous Potemkin uprising, and widespread chaos. Under immense pressure, Nicholas II reluctantly issues the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties, including freedom of speech and assembly, and the creation of an elected parliament, the State Duma. For a moment, it seems like Russia might be on a path to constitutional monarchy. However, you observe that the Tsar retains vast autocratic powers, including the ability to dissolve the Duma at will. And dissolve it he does multiple times. It seems the Tsar treated the Duma much like that expensive exercise bike one buys with New Year's resolutions. It's there. You might even give it a token spin occasionally for show, but you're certainly not letting it dictate your actual destination or pace. One particularly stark reminder that the government's methods hadn't fundamentally changed was the Lena Goldfields massacre in 1912. Striking miners in remote Siberia, protesting harsh conditions, were brutally shot down by the army. This event sent shockwaves through Russia, highlighting the regime's continued reliance on violence and further radicalizing the labor movement. It was clear that the concessions of 1905 were, in many ways, superficial. Historians still debate whether meaningful reform and a genuine transition to a constitutional monarchy were ever truly possible in Russia after 1905, or if the deep-seated autocratic traditions, the Tsar's personal commitment to upholding those traditions, and the growing impatience of revolutionary groups made a violent upheaval almost inevitable. And then there's Grigory Rasputin. You remember Alexandra's desperate reliance on him for Alexei's health. Now you see his shadow looming large over the political landscape. His apparent influence over the Tsarina, and through her over state appointments and policy, becomes a national scandal. Whispers and lurid rumors about his debauchery and power fill the salons of St. Petersburg and the columns of newspapers, both Russian and foreign. He becomes a symbol of the decay and corruption at the heart of the imperial system. Even if his actual political influence was exaggerated by his enemies, the perception of his power did immense damage to the monarchy's prestige. Rasputin himself seemed to have more lives than a video game character armed with a popular cheat code, surviving assassination attempts and public disgrace that would have utterly destroyed any other public figure. Perhaps it was, as his supporters claimed, all down to his profound piety, or perhaps something else entirely. Into this volatile mix, this cauldron of peasant misery, worker anger, political incompetence, and widespread disillusionment, comes the final unbearable strain, World War I. When Russia enters the war in August 1914, there's an initial surge of patriotic fervor. But the enthusiasm quickly sours as the Russian army suffers devastating losses and the war drags on. You see the home front crumbling under the pressure. Food shortages, rampant inflation, and millions of grieving families. The Tsar, taking personal command of the army at the front in 1915, a disastrous decision that directly links him to every military failure, leaves Alexandra and, by extension Rasputin, in effective control back in the capital, Petrograd. Petersburg was renamed to sound less German. The seeds of revolution, so long dormant or slowly germinating, are now watered by the blood of soldiers and the tears of a suffering nation, and they are about to burst forth with unstoppable force. The seeds of revolution, which you saw being watered by blood and tears at the close of the last World War, now burst forth with a terrifying, chaotic energy. It's late February 1917 on the Julian calendar used in Russia, already March in the West. In Petrograd, the imperial capital you once explored in its gilded splendor, is a city on the edge. You feel the biting wind whipping down the Nevsky Prospect, but now it carries not just snow, but the shouts of striking workers, the rumble of angry crowds, and the ominous crackle of gunfire. The initial spark. Women textile workers, fed up with bread queues that stretched for blocks in the freezing cold, walk out of their factories. Soon they are joined by tens, then hundreds of thousands of other workers. The government orders troops to fire on the protesters, but this time something is different. Soldiers, many of them recent conscripts, weary of the endless war and sympathetic to the crowds, begin to hesitate, then to mutiny, joining the revolution. The authority of the Tsar's government crumbles like a stale loaf of bread. While Petrograd boils, you find Tsar Nicholas II far away at army headquarters in Mogilev. He receives fragmented reports, initially dismissing the unrest as hooliganism. Isolated from the true scale of the chaos, he attempts to return to his family at Tsarskoye Selo, but his imperial train, usually a symbol of unstoppable power and direct routes, suddenly finds itself playing an unscheduled game of dodge the revolutionaries on the railway sidings, diverted and blocked by revolutionary troops. Not quite the scenic route he'd envisioned. He is trapped, a monarch without a capital, a commander without loyal troops. The pressure mounts. His generals, pragmatic and fearful of a complete breakdown of the war effort against Germany, advise him that the only way to save Russia, and perhaps the monarchy in some form, is for him to step down. Duma politicians echo the same grim message. You are there in his private railway carriage at Pskov on March 2nd, 1917, old style, as he makes the agonizing decision. With a heavy heart, he signs the abdication manifesto. Initially, he abdicates in favor of his young son, Alexei. But then, remembering the boy's fragile health and not wanting to be separated from him, he amends it, passing the throne to his younger brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. It's a momentous act. 300 years of Romanov rule, an autocratic dynasty that once seemed as immutable as the Russian winter, ends not with a bang, but with the scratch of a pen in a dimly lit railway car. The mainstream historical fact here is often overlooked. The February Revolution was largely a spontaneous, leaderless uprising. It wasn't until later, in October, that the Bolsheviks would seize power in their more organized coup. Grand Duke Michael, however, proves to be a reluctant czar. Advised that he too would have no real support, he declines the throne the very next day, unless it is offered to him by a future constituent assembly. Russia is left without a monarch, and power passes to a shaky provisional government, composed mainly of former Duma liberals, with a Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers' deputies, wielding considerable influence alongside it. Now you follow the former Tsar, no longer His Imperial Majesty, but Citizen Romanov, or more charitably, Colonel Romanov, as he finally makes his way back to Tsarskoye Selo and the Alexander Palace. Imagine the scene. The man who, just days before, was the absolute ruler of a sixth of the world's landmass, now returning as a private citizen, essentially a prisoner. his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, who are, by a cruel twist of fate, all suffering from a severe bout of measles at this critical juncture, greet him with a mixture of relief and profound shock. Life in the Alexander Palace changes dramatically. The familiar routines you observed earlier are shattered. The imperial standards are lowered. Guards, initially some of their own loyal retainers, are soon replaced by soldiers appointed by the provisional government, their demeanor shifting from respectful to indifferent and eventually to openly hostile. They are confined to a section of the palace and grounds. Their correspondence is censored, their visitors restricted. You see them trying to adapt to this new, bewildering reality. Nicholas, surprisingly, takes to physical labor with a certain stoic enthusiasm. From autocrat of all the Russias to chief lumberjack of Tsarskoye Selo, quite the career change. You almost have to wonder if he updated his LinkedIn profile. Experienced in ruling vast empires, now proficient in firewood production. He chops wood, clears snow, and creates a vegetable garden with the children, perhaps finding a strange solace in the physical exertion and the semblance of a normal, productive life. Alexandra, always reserved, withdraws further, finding strength in her faith and her family. The children, despite their illness and the uncertainty, show remarkable resilience. Lessons continue, organized by their tutors. They read, play games, and try to maintain a sense of normalcy within their shrinking world. You see them tending to their small garden plots, a poignant image of imperial children trying to cultivate life amidst the ruins of their empire. Yet the atmosphere is thick with unspoken fears. What will become of them? Initially, there's hope, a belief that they might be allowed to go into exile, perhaps to England, where King George V is Nicholas's first cousin. But as the weeks turn into months, that hope begins to fade. The provisional government, led by figures like Alexander Kerensky, faces an immense dilemma. What to do with the Romanovs? Letting them go abroad could create a rallying point for counter-revolutionaries. Keeping them near Petrograd leaves them vulnerable to the increasingly radical mobs and the growing power of the Bolsheviks, who demand a harsher reckoning for the former Tsar. Historians still debate whether, had Nicholas II acted more decisively and offered significant concessions earlier in 1917, say during the initial days of the Petrograd strikes, the monarchy could have survived in some constitutional form, or if the revolutionary momentum, fueled by years of war and hardship, was already too powerful to be contained by any reform. Kerensky himself visits the family on several occasions. You see him, a young, ambitious lawyer, suddenly thrust into a position of immense power, trying to manage this delicate and dangerous situation. He's not unkind to them personally, but he's also acutely aware of the political pressures. The provisional government is handling the Romanov problem like a hot potato wrapped in a delicate fabric too dangerous to hold onto, too symbolically charged, and potentially valuable as a political pawn to simply drop or let go. The family's safety becomes a growing concern. The initial period of relative calm in their captivity, uncomfortable as it is drawing to a close. The walls are closing in, metaphorically and literally, as the revolutionary tide outside grows ever more menacing and the whispers of a more definitive and ominous solution begin to circulate. The menacing revolutionary tide you sensed rising around the Alexander Palace is now about to sweep the Romanovs far from everything they've ever known. Alexander Kerensky, still grappling with that hot potato of what to do with the former imperial family, becomes increasingly alarmed by the deteriorating security in Petrograd. Soldiers are growing more radical, and he fears either a violent mob attack on the palace or, perhaps just as worrying for his government, a monarchist attempt to liberate the Tsar. His solution? Move them far away to the remote Siberian town of Tobolsk, a place so obscure he hopes they'll be out of sight, out of mind, and most importantly, safe, or at least manageable. You were there in the dead of night, August 1st, 1917, old style, as the Romanovs are discreetly ushered out of the Alexander Palace. It's all very hush-hush, less like an imperial family relocation and more like a scene from a rather downbeat spy movie, albeit one where the principal agents are really into collecting religious icons and had recently been quite keen on amateur gardening. Imagine the quiet footsteps in darkened corridors, the whispered goodbyes to the few remaining loyal servants, the final, lingering look at the home that, for all its recent constraints, was still home. Then they are on a train, not an imperial one this time, but one rather blandly and deceptively, marked with signs indicating a Japanese Red Cross mission, a mainstream historical fact meant to throw off potential troublemakers or overly curious eyes along the route. The destination, deep into Siberia. The journey itself is long and uncomfortable, a stark contrast to their previous luxurious travels. You feel the monotonous rhythm of the train wheels, carrying them further and further into an uncertain future. Nicholas and Alexandra, their four daughters, and the still frail Alexei occupy cramped compartments. They are accompanied by a retinue of loyal attendants who have chosen to share their exile, at least for now. Through the train windows, they catch glimpses of a country in turmoil, the vastness of Russia unfolding before them. But it's a Russia that no longer belongs to them. They arrive in Tobolsk and are housed in the former governor's mansion. It's spacious enough, certainly, but it's no palace. Initially, life settles into a new routine, an echo of their Tsarskoye Selo confinement. Nicholas reads, teaches history to Alexei, and yes, resumes his wood chopping with vigor. Alexandra does needlework and worries. The girls continue their lessons, help with household chores, and try to keep their spirits up. There are even church services held in the house. For a brief period, there's a semblance of stability, a fragile peace in the eye of the revolutionary storm. But then in October 1917, November by the Western calendar, everything changes. News slow to travel to remote Tobolsk finally arrives. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, have seized power in Petrograd. The provisional government is overthrown. This isn't just a shift in guards. It's a fundamental alteration of their universe. Their captors become harsher, more ideologically driven. Rations are cut. The few remaining loyal attendants are gradually dismissed or arrested. The soldiers guarding them, once somewhat respectful, now sneer openly, their hostility a constant, unnerving presence. The new Bolshevik guards in Tobolsk probably didn't give 2 kopecks for Nicholas's wood-chopping skills. They were far more interested in chopping his family's rations than any lingering privileges. Sorry, Comrade Romanov, you can almost hear them say, firewood quotas are down this month, but suffering quotas are definitely up. Any faint hopes they might have harbored of asylum in England, perhaps facilitated by Alexandra's cousin king, George V, completely evaporate. While the king had earlier explored such possibilities, the political climate in Britain was unfavorable, and now with the fiercely anti-monarchist Bolsheviks in power, the gates to the west are firmly, irrevocably slammed shut. The Bolsheviks in Moscow now have direct control over their most prized prisoners. There's talk of putting Nicholas the Bloody on trial. However, the Russian Civil War is erupting with white armies, loyal to the old regime or opposed to the Bolsheviks, forming in various parts of the country. Siberia itself is becoming a contested region. The Romanovs in Tobolsk are suddenly a strategic liability, a potential rallying point if a white army were to reach them. The decision is made. They must be moved again, this time to a more securely Bolshevik-controlled area, and perhaps closer to Moscow for that anticipated trial. The chosen destination, Ekaterinburg, a staunchly Bolshevik industrial city nestled in the Ural Mountains. The journey from Tobolsk in the spring of 1918 is a nightmare. Alexei suffers a severe hemophiliac hemorrhage, rendering him completely bedridden and in agony. He cannot be moved. It's a heart-wrenching decision for Nicholas and Alexandra. Do they all stay and risk capture, by potentially less predictable forces, or do they split the family? It's the ultimate Sophie's Choice meets worst family road trip ever scenario. In April, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their daughter Maria, chosen perhaps for her strength and calm demeanor, set off first, entrusted to a Bolshevik commissar named Vasily Yakovlev. They leave Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and the desperately ill Alexei behind in Tobolsk, promising to send for them as soon as Alexei is well enough to travel. The farewell is agonizing. Their journey with Yakovlev is fraught with peril and ambiguity. They travel by open sleighs and rough peasant carts over partially thawed rivers and muddy, rutted tracks, a brutal experience for the former empress, who is already in poor health. Historians still debate Vasily Yakovlev's true mission and intentions. Was he a straightforward Bolshevik operative following orders to deliver the Romanovs to Ekaterinburg, or, as some evidence suggests, was he perhaps acting on more obscure orders from Moscow, maybe even trying to get them to Omsk, further east, potentially to safety or for a different political purpose? At one point, near Omsk, their train is indeed halted by the aggressive Ural Regional Soviet based in Ekaterinburg, who insist the prisoners be brought to their city. Yakovlev is overruled. The train is rerouted. You can feel the atmosphere shift dramatically as they approach Ekaterinburg. Hostile crowds greet their arrival. Red Guards are everywhere. This is not just captivity, it's enemy territory. After a brief, tense period, they are taken to a large requisition house in the center of the city, owned by a merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev. High wooden fences are hastily erected around it. Windows are painted over. It is designated, with chilling bureaucratic euphemism, the House of Special Purpose. The journey has ended, but a new, far more terrifying chapter is about to begin. The remaining children and Alexei, after his partial recovery, will follow them there a few weeks later, reuniting the family for their final ordeal. The heavy gates of the Ipatiev House creak shut behind Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria, and you feel an almost physical sense of finality. This is Ekaterinburg, deep in the Ural Mountains, a city Tsarevich heartland, a Bolshevik power. The house itself, a merchant's spacious dwelling, is now officially designated the Dom Osobogo Nazначenia, the House of Special Purpose. A rather chillingly bureaucratic term, isn't it? It's less a home and more a fortress designed to keep its special occupants in and the outside world out. High wooden fences, initially one, then a second, taller one, are hastily erected, obscuring any view. The windows on their floor are soon painted over with whitewash. The Bolsheviks weren't exactly aiming for an open concept living situation here. More like early dungeon chic with a strict no peekaboo policy, ensuring maximum isolation. You step inside, and the atmosphere is thick with tension and the smell of cheap tobacco, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present dampness of a house not quite aired enough. The initial contingent of guards is a motley crew, mostly local factory workers and demobilized soldiers, full of revolutionary zeal but often lacking discipline. They are under the command of Alexander Avdiv, a man who seems to enjoy his newfound power a little too much. You see them lounging around, their rifles clattering on a floor, often drunk, their conversation coarse and abusive. Some of those early guards seem to treat their sentry duty at the Ipatiev House less like a serious revolutionary task and more like an all-inclusive, if rather grim, holiday camp with bonus opportunities for petty theft and off-key renditions of revolutionary anthems. Human resources probably wasn't their strong suit, and their behavior is a constant source of torment for the captive family. Crude drawings and revolutionary slogans begin to appear on the walls of their quarters and the hallways, a daily reminder of their captors' contempt. The Romanovs and Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria initially are confined to a few rooms on the upper floor. Privacy becomes a forgotten luxury. Doors are often left ajar, and guards peer in at will. Their belongings are searched, and items frequently go missing. The food is meager, often burnt or poorly prepared, a far cry from the imperial kitchens you might have glimpsed in their past. A mainstream historical fact highlighting their confinement is that those painted windows were, in many cases, also sealed shut, even as the Ural summer brought stifling heat. The air in their rooms becomes heavy and oppressive. In late May 1918, a flicker of bittersweet joy. The rest of the children arrive. Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and the frail Tsarevich Alexei, finally well enough to make the arduous journey from Tobolsk, are reunited with their parents and sister. Imagine that moment. The tears, the embraces, the relief of being together again, however grim the circumstances. But this reunion is overshadowed by the oppressive reality of their prison. Alexei, still weak from his recent illness, requires constant care. The girls, resourceful as ever, try to make the best of things, mending clothes, helping to clean their cramped quarters, and reading to their brother. You observe their attempts to maintain a semblance of their former life, a quiet defiance against the degradation. Nicholas reads aloud to the family in the evenings. Alexandra, though often suffering from ill health and heart palpitations, finds solace in her deep religious faith. Her Bible and prayer books her constant companions. They hold simple church services when permitted, their voices hushed as they recite the familiar liturgy. Lessons for Alexei continue, a poignant attempt to maintain normalcy. Trying to concentrate on French verbs or Russian history while armed revolutionaries are stomping around downstairs, their crude laughter echoing, and your future is less certain than the quality of tomorrow's watery soup that takes a special kind of familial focus. You've got to admire their quiet commitment to the curriculum and to each other in the face of such overwhelming adversity. Days blur into a monotonous routine, waking, meager meals, a brief supervised period of exercise in the small enclosed garden, their promenade, more reading, quiet conversation, and then the unsettling nights filled with the jarring sounds of their guards. They are completely cut off from the outside world, save for a few heavily censored Bolshevik newspapers filled with propaganda and news of the escalating civil war. The White armies are reportedly advancing in Siberia, a fact that brings both a dangerous sliver of hope and a heightened sense of dread. Would they be rescued? Or would their proximity to the front lines hasten a more terrible fate? Then, in early July 1918, there's a significant change. Alexander Avdiv, deemed too lax and perhaps too susceptible to corruption or even a strange sympathy for his prisoners, is replaced as commandant. His successor is Yakov Yurovsky, a Chekist, a member of the Bolshevik secret police. Yurovsky is a different breed altogether, cold, methodical, and efficient. He's a stern disciplinarian, and under his command, the guards become more organized, the atmosphere more overtly menacing. One of his first actions is to take a detailed inventory of all the Romanovs' remaining valuables, particularly their jewels. Alexandra and her daughters had cleverly sewn many of their gems into the linings of their corsets and clothes, hoping to keep them hidden. Yurovsky's meticulous search for these hidden treasures signals the new, more ominous phase. The net is tightening. Historians still debate the degree of direct communication and the precise nature of orders flowing between Lenin and the central Bolshevik leadership in Moscow and the increasingly autonomous Euro-Regional Soviet in Ekaterinburg regarding the Romanovs' ultimate fate in these crucial weeks. Will the local Bolsheviks acting on their own initiative, driven by fear of the approaching White armies, or were they following explicit, if perhaps deniable, instructions from the very top? The truth remains shrouded in the fog of revolution and conflicting accounts. With Yurovsky's arrival, any lingering illusions of a trial or eventual release begin to evaporate. The family can feel it. The air in the Ipatiev house grows heavier, charged with unspoken fear. The guards are more watchful, their expressions harder. The sense of being trapped, of being merely pawns in a brutal political game whose rules they cannot comprehend, becomes overwhelming. You see the anxiety etched on Alexandra's face, the quiet resignation in Nicholas's eyes, the brave attempts of the children to comfort each other. The House of Special Purpose is living up to its name, but the purpose, it is becoming chillingly clear, is not preservation but something far darker. The final act of their tragedy is rapidly approaching. The oppressive air you felt inside the Ipatiev House, thick with fear under Yakov Yurovsky's methodical command, now becomes charged with a new, frantic energy emanating from outside its high wooden fences. It's July 1918. The Russian Civil War is raging, and the anti-Bolshevik White Armies, spearheaded by the well-organized Czechoslovak Legion, are closing in on Ekaterinburg. You can almost hear the distant rumble of artillery, the soundtrack to the Ural Soviets' mounting panic. If Ekaterinburg falls, and the Romanovs are liberated, Nicholas could become a powerful living symbol for the counter-revolution, a rallying point that could tip the scales against the fledgling Bolshevik regime. The local Bolsheviks, a particularly hard-line group, are determined this will not happen. They weren't exactly wringing their hands with indecision about what to do with the Tsar. Many had execute Romanovs penciled in on their revolutionary to-do list practically since they learned to spell commissar. The approaching White Armies just gave them the perfect, urgent excuse to finally tick it off with a thick red marker. The question that has echoed down through the decades, debated in hushed tones in countless history seminars and screamed across internet forums, is this: who ultimately gave the order to kill not just Nicholas Romanov, but his entire family and their few remaining loyal attendants? Was it a calculated decision from the very top, from Lenin and his right-hand man Yakov Sverdlov in Moscow? Or was it a more localized, panicked decision by the Ural Regional Soviet, fearing the imminent fall of Ekaterinburg? You see Philip Golashiokin, the military commissar of the Ural region and a close associate of Sverdlov, making an urgent journey to Moscow in early July. This is a well-established historical fact. Golashiokin was in Moscow, meeting with Lenin and Sverdlov just days before the murders, roughly between July 3rd and July 10th. Imagine him in the Kremlin, laying out the dire military situation, the proximity of the Whites, the problem of the Romanovs. What was said in those crucial meetings? Did Golashiokin return to Ekaterinburg with explicit instructions, a verbal nod and wink from Lenin to proceed with the liquidation? Or did he perhaps receive a more ambiguous mandate, a sort of, what needs to be done, act as the situation demands kind of directive? The decision to kill the Romanovs, if formally made, wasn't exactly minuted, signed in triplicate, and then thoughtfully posted on the Kremlin's public bulletin board for all to see. It was far more likely it needs to be done. Don't ask too many questions, don't tell anyone who doesn't need to know, and for heaven's sake, leave no incriminating paper trail kind of understanding. No definitive signed document from Lenin ordering the execution has ever surfaced. Those who argue for direct central command often point to later accounts, like Leon Trotsky's famous diary entry, written years after the event, where he recounts Sverdlov informing him that we decided it here, in Moscow, and that Lenin believed it was necessary not to leave the Whites a live banner to rally around. Others point to a series of coded telegrams exchanged between Ekaterinburg and Moscow. But trying to decipher these Bolshevik telegrams a century later is sometimes like attempting to read your gray tant's most cryptic and poorly punctuated text messages. You think you have a grasp of what they're implying, but there's always that nagging possibility they're just inquiring about the local weather conditions or reminding you to feed the cat. The language is often oblique, referring to the baggage or the trial in ways that could be interpreted or misinterpreted to suit various arguments. Publicly, the Bolshevik line was still that Nicholas Romanov would eventually be brought to trial in Moscow. This was the official story, the one meant for public consumption both domestically and internationally. The murder of the entire family, including the children and the servants, was a far more extreme act than a politically motivated trial and execution of the former Tsar alone. It smacked of a ruthlessness that even some Bolsheviks might have found unsettling, or at least politically inconvenient to acknowledge openly. This leads to the ongoing, fierce scholarly debate. Did Lenin and Sverdlov issue explicit verbal orders for the execution of the entire Romanov family and their retinue? Or did the Ural Soviet, led by men like Alexander Beloborodov, the chairman of the Ural Soviet Presidium, and Goloshokin, act largely on its own initiative, perhaps misinterpreting vague instructions from Moscow, or simply taking advantage of a perceived blank check to resolve their Romanov problem in the most final way possible as the military situation deteriorated? The Ural Bolsheviks were certainly ideologically predisposed to such a brutal course of action. They saw themselves as frontline warriors of the revolution, and for them, the Romanovs were not just prisoners but potent symbols of the hated old regime, symbols that needed to be utterly eradicated. As July wears on, and the White Armies draw ever nearer, you sense the decision crystallizing in the smoke-filled rooms of Ekaterinburg. Whether by direct order, tacit approval, or local initiative fueled by panic and ideological fervor, the Ural Soviet resolves to act. The planned trial is now a fiction. The new plan is swift, secret, and brutal. The entire family must go. No survivors. No potential heirs. No living icons for the whites. It's a decision driven by a cold, revolutionary logic. Terrorize your enemies and ensure the past stays buried. Yakov Yurovsky, the cool-headed commandant of the House of Special Purpose, is the man tasked with organizing the gruesome details. He begins to make his preparations with the same chilling efficiency he displayed when cataloging the family's hidden jewels. The executioners are selected, the location within the house chosen, and the plans for the disposal of the bodies considered. The net that had been tightening around the Romanovs for months is now, in these humid July days of 1918, being drawn for the final fatal catch. The whispers of an order to kill have solidified into a concrete, terrifying reality, and the machinery of death is quietly being set in motion within the walls of that ominous house. The shadowy decision to eradicate the Romanovs has been made, somewhere in the fraught corridors of power between Ekaterinburg and Moscow. Now you turn your attention to the man entrusted with turning this brutal decree into reality, Yakov Mikhailovich Yurovsky. He's the commandant of the House of Special Purpose, the chief jailer, and soon the chief executioner. To understand the grim events that are about to unfold, you need to understand him, this quiet, methodical orchestrator of imperial doom. Yurovsky is not a frothing, wild-eyed fanatic, at least not outwardly. He's a man of around 40 with a dark mustache and intense, focused eyes. Born into a large Jewish family, a fact later seized upon by anti-Semitic propagandists trying to frame the regicide as a ritual murder. His father was a watchmaker and glazier, and Yakov himself trained as a watchmaker before also becoming a photographer. A rather poignant historical fact often surfaces here. Yurovsky, as a young apprentice photographer in Tomsk, had actually encountered Nicholas II once, years before the revolution when Nicholas, then Tsarevich, was on a tour of Siberia. A fleeting, inconsequential meeting at the time, yet history, with its penchant for cruel ironies, would bring them together again under drastically different circumstances. His path to Bolshevism was gradual but firm. He spent time in Germany, converted to Lutheranism, though his commitment to religion seems to have been superficial and temporary, and became involved in revolutionary circles. By 1918, he is a dedicated Chekist, a member of the Chaika, a formidable Bolshevik secret police. He has a reputation for being disciplined, incorruptible, unlike some of his predecessors at the Ipatiev House, intelligent, and utterly ruthless when it comes to serving the revolution. He approached organizing a regicide, it seems, with the same meticulous, detail-oriented energy most people might reserve for planning a moderately complex IKEA furniture assembly, or perhaps, given his original trade, repairing a particularly intricate timepiece. Checklists, Nagin revolvers, sulfuric acid. Just your average Tuesday's tasks for a truly dedicated Chekist operative in revolutionary Russia. When Yurovsky took over as commandant from the more erratic Avdiv, the atmosphere in the Ipatiev House shifted. The guards became more orderly, but also more menacing. Yurovsky himself had some direct interactions with the Romanovs. He was present during the inventory of their jewels. Dr. Bakin, the loyal family physician who chose to stay with him until the end, noted Yurovsky's efficiency but also his cold, detached demeanor. There was no unnecessary cruelty in his daily interactions, but also no flicker of warmth or human sympathy. He was a man with a job to do, and he intended to do it thoroughly. Now, with the order given, however opaquely, Yurovsky sets about his grim task. He's dissatisfied with many of the regular Russian guards at the Ipatiev House. He considers them unreliable, perhaps too prone to drunkenness, or even worse, potentially susceptible to last-minute pangs of conscience or sympathy when faced with the reality of killing the Tsar's young daughters and son. So he carefully selects his execution squad, his commando. This core group includes several Latvians, often referred to as Lets in historical accounts. Latvian riflemen had a reputation within the Bolshevik forces for being disciplined, fiercely loyal, and utterly ruthless, ideal candidates for a job requiring unwavering obedience. He also includes a few trusted ethnic Russians. Historians still debate the exact number and identities of all the men in Yurovsky's execution squad, as lists compiled later by various sources, including Yurovsky himself, sometimes differ, and some participants undoubtedly preferred to remain anonymous or had their roles deliberately obscured in the aftermath. What mattered to Yurovsky was that these were men he believed would follow orders without hesitation or question. His preparations are chillingly methodical. You observe him inspecting the Ipatiev house for the most suitable location. He needs a place where the deed can be done with minimal noise and maximum containment. He settles on a semi-basement room. It's relatively small, about 5 meters by 6, with a barred window looking out onto an embankment, making escape impossible and limiting outside visibility. Crucially, it has a thick brick wall that he hopes will absorb the sound of bullets, and an external door nearby for removing the bodies. The Ipatiev house basement wasn't exactly vying for 5-star accommodation status on any travel website, but Yurovsky wasn't particularly concerned with securing good TripAdvisor reviews. His criteria were more practical. Pros: secure, mostly windowless, sound dampening potential. Cons: slightly damp, about to become historically infamous due to multiple homicides. Perfect. Next, the logistics of disposal. Yurovsky arranges for a Fiat truck to be waiting in the courtyard, its engine running at the appointed time. This is intended both to help muffle the sounds of the execution and to transport the bodies away from the house immediately afterwards. He also personally supervises the procurement of vital supplies for what comes after the killing: several cans of gasoline or kerosene and a large quantity of sulfuric acid. Spades and ropes are also gathered. This forethought indicates that the plan was never just to kill the Romanovs, but to utterly destroy their remains, to leave no trace, no relics for the counter-revolution to venerate. Throughout these preparations, you see Yurovsky maintaining an air of calm, almost bureaucratic efficiency. He discusses weapon assignments with his chosen executioners. He checks and rechecks the details. It's the eve of July 16th, 1918. A deceptive quiet settles over the house of special purpose. The Romanovs are unaware of the intricate and terrible preparations being finalized just floors below them. They follow their usual restricted routine: a meager dinner, quiet family time prayers. Later that night, well past midnight, Yurovsky will wake them. He will tell them with that same detached professionalism that there is unrest in the town, that fighting has broken out, and that for their own safety, they must be moved immediately to the basement. It's the ultimate in darkly ironic excuses. There's some trouble brewing in Ekaterinburg tonight, so we're just going to move you all to a much safer, much cozier room in the basement. No, no, don't worry about packing your hidden diamonds or your favorite pillows. It's just a very temporary measure for your protection. If only they had an inkling of what kind of safety he and the revolution he so fervently served truly had in store for them. The stage is now fully set. The chillingly deceptive words of Yakov Yurovsky that they must move to the basement for their own safety hang in the stale air of the Ipatiev House. It's well past midnight, now the early hours of July 17th, 1918. You watch as the Romanov family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their son Alexei, and their four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, are awakened. Along with them are their four remaining loyal attendants, Dr. Eugene Botkin, the devoted family physician, Anna Demidova, the Empress's maid, clutching a pillow, Ivan Karatanov, the cook, and Alexei Trupp, the footman. Being told you're moving to the basement for safety in the middle of the night by a man who's been meticulously cataloging your family jewels with an unsettling precision, it's probably not a situation that inspires a particularly cozy feeling of security. More like my spidey senses are definitely tingling, and this isn't the fun superhero kind of way moment. You follow their somber procession down the wooden staircase, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet of the house. There's a palpable sense of unease, of unspoken dread, though perhaps not yet a full comprehension of what awaits them. They reach the semi-basement room that Yurovsky had so carefully selected. It's small, stark, and dimly lit by a single bare bulb. The walls are rough plaster. The air is cool and damp. There's virtually no furniture. Yurovsky, ever the seemingly considerate host in this macabre play, has two chairs brought in. Alexandra takes one, her face etched with anxiety. Alexei, too weak to stand for long due to his hemophilia, is seated in the other, resting in his father's arms or close beside him. Nicholas stands, as do the Grand Duchesses and the attendants, clustered together, a small, isolated group in the center of this barren, oppressive space. Then the execution squad files in. 11 or 12 armed men, a mixture of Latvians and Russians handpicked by Yurovsky, cramming themselves into the already confined room. You see the glint of their Nagin revolvers and Mauser pistols. The family and their attendants look on, their confusion turning to dawning horror. Yurovsky steps forward. He pulls a piece of paper from his pocket and reads, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a brief, brutal pronouncement from the Presidium of the Ural Regional Soviet. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their offensive against Soviet Russia, the Presidium of the Ural Regional Soviet has decided to sentence you to death. Nicholas, stunned, reportedly turns to his family, perhaps uttering a disbelieving, "What? What? Or so you're not taking us anywhere." Doctor, Bakken might have asked for clarification. There is no time for answers, no room for appeals. Yurovsky quickly repeats the sentence, and then he gives the signal. Fire. The small room explodes with the roar of gunfire, a deafening cacophony in the enclosed space. For a supposedly elite firing squad, their initial performance is tragically, brutally chaotic. It seems precision regicide wasn't a core module in advanced Bolshevik marksmanship training. Each executioner had supposedly been assigned a specific target, with Nicholas himself being Yurovsky's. The XR falls quickly, as does Alexandra, struck by multiple bullets. Doctor. Botkin, in a final act of loyalty, a well-documented historical fact is that he, Demidova, Karatanov, and Trupp all chose to stay with the Romanovs and died alongside them, may have instinctively tried to shield the Tsarina or another family member. He too is cut down. Karatanov and Trupp also fall in the initial hail of lead. But it's not over. The room is filled with thick, acrid black powder smoke, the screams of the wounded, and the panicked shouts of the executioners. Through the haze, you see that several of the victims are still alive. The Grand Duchesses, in particular, seem almost supernaturally resilient. This isn't due to any miracle, but to a grimly practical reason you recall from Yurovsky's earlier inventory: the jewels. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia had, under their mother's instruction, sewn diamonds, pearls, and other precious gems into the linings of their corsets and undergarments, hoping to keep some wealth hidden. The Romanov girls, in their tragic naivety, had unwittingly turned their corsets into makeshift, yet partial, bulletproof vests. It's a testament to Imperial Blink's unexpected defensive capabilities, though sadly, not nearly enough to alter their ultimate, horrifying fate. Talk about a fashion statement with truly unintended and ultimately futile consequences. The bullets from the initial volley, striking these jewel-padded corsets, had failed to penetrate deeply or cause immediately fatal wounds. Anna Demidova, the maid, also survives the first barrage, perhaps protected by the pillow she carried, which was also reportedly filled with jewels. Now ensues a scene of unimaginable horror. The executioners, some perhaps unnerved by the survival of their targets, others possibly fueled by alcohol or bloodlust, reload or draw other weapons. They stumble through the smoke-filled room, finishing off the wounded with bayonets and more point-blank shots. It's a brutal, chaotic butchery. Yurovsky, trying to regain control, reportedly steps over bodies to dispatch Alexei himself, who, terrified and wounded, remains in his chair. The daughters are subjected to a final, terrible onslaught. The sounds are horrific: the crack of pistols, the dull thud of bayonets, the moans and cries of the dying, the hoarse shouts of the killers. The entire massacre, from the reading of the sentence to the last shot, probably takes no more than 20 minutes, but for those experiencing it, it must have been an eternity of terror and agony. Finally, an eerie silence descends, broken only by the gasping breaths of the executioners and the dripping sound of blood. The room is a charnel house. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder, smoke, and warm blood. Yurovsky and his men, their faces grim, perhaps spattered with blood, check the bodies for any signs of life. One by one, they confirm the deaths. 11 people who just moments before were alive, a family and their loyal retainers, now lie slaughtered in this small, squalid basement room in Ekaterinburg, their imperial lineage and past glories rendered meaningless in the face of revolutionary brutality. The House of Special Purpose has fulfilled its terrible, unspoken promise. The echoes of the last gunshot in that small, blood-soaked basement room of the Ipatiev House have barely faded, and already Yakov Yurovsky's grim work continues. The immediate pressing task: concealing the crime. 11 bodies, the Tsar, Tsarina, their 5 children, and their 4 loyal attendants, must vanish, erased not just from life, but from the very earth, leaving no trace for monarchist sympathizers to discover, no relics to venerate, no evidence for future investigators. You are now a spectral witness to this desperate, brutal, and often shockingly inept effort to hide an imperial massacre. Under Yurovsky's terse commands, the bodies are hastily wrapped in bed sheets taken from the family's own rooms. They are carried out of the basement, up the stairs, through the now silent house, and into the courtyard where the Fiat truck, its engine likely still running as planned, awaits. Imagine the scene: the dead weight of the victims, the hurried, strained efforts of the executioners now turned pallbearers, the dark stains seeping through the sheets, the trail of blood marking their path. It's a clumsy, gruesome process, carried out in the pre-dawn darkness of July 17th. The truck, loaded with its tragic cargo, rumbles out of Ekaterinburg, heading north along the Koptyaki Road. Yurovsky is in charge, accompanied by several of his commando. Their initial destination is a remote area known as Ganina Yama, Ganya's Pit, a collection of abandoned iron or mine shafts surrounded by dense forest. This, Yurovsky believes, will be the perfect, isolated spot for the final disposal. His original plan seems to have been to dump the bodies down one of the shafts and perhaps use explosives to collapse it. But Ganina Yama quickly turns into a scene of chaotic frustration. Yurovsky's crew weren't exactly winning any awards for most efficient post-regicide body disposal team of the year. It was rapidly devolving into a dark comedy of errors, a gruesome ballet of incompetence involving stubbornly uncooperative corpses, wet wood, not nearly enough acid, and a pervasive, growing sense of "are we there yet?" with a whole erasing a dynasty from history project. The chosen mine shaft isn't deep enough, or it's partially flooded, and the bodies won't sink from sight. So the plan shifts. They will burn them. You witness the frantic efforts to gather wood, to build pyres. But the wood is damp, the forest floor moist. The fires struggle to take hold, producing more smoke than flame. The bodies, stripped of their clothes, which are also burned, sometimes revealing more hidden jewels that the guards greedily pocket, are laid on the pyres. It's a horrific, Dantean scene. The flickering, inadequate flames, the smell of burning flesh and hair mixing with the scent of pine and damp earth, the grotesque sight of partially charred remains. Yurovsky then brings out the sulfuric acid he had so carefully procured. He orders his men to pour it over the bodies, hoping to disfigure them beyond recognition and accelerate their destruction. But again, there's not enough acid to do the job properly on 11 corpses. It causes horrific burns, yes, but it doesn't dissolve them. Hours pass. Daylight comes and goes. The men are exhausted. Some are drunk, their nerves frayed by the horrific task and the eerie surroundings. Yurovsky, though, remains grimly determined, pushing them on. He realizes, however, that Ganina Yama is a failure. The disposal is incomplete, the site too obvious, and too many people, including some local peasants who stumbled upon the cordon, are now aware that something significant and terrible is happening there. He needs a new, more secret plan. On the night of July 18th, nearly 2 full days after the murders, the decision is made to move the bodies again. The remaining corpses are loaded back onto the truck. Yurovsky's new idea is to take them to some deeper copper mines further away. But fate, or perhaps just revolutionary Russia's notoriously bad roads, intervenes. The Fiat truck, lurching through the darkness with its gruesome load, gets well and truly stuck in a patch of boggy mud near a railway crossing known as Crossing No. 184, in an area called Porosenkov Log Pig's Meadow. You just know Yurovsky wasn't getting his security deposit back on that Fiat rental after this particular outing. This mishap, however, proves decisive. Exhausted under pressure, and with dawn approaching, Yurovsky makes a new final plan right there on the muddy track. He decides to bury most of the bodies directly under the roadway itself, hoping the passage of carts and vehicles will further pack down the earth and conceal the grave. A shallow pit is hastily dug. 9 of the victims are laid within it. Before they are covered, more sulfuric acid is poured over them. Then railway ties are placed over the grave, and the earth is smoothed over, an attempt to make it look like an ordinary, undisturbed section of the track. A mainstream historical fact is that this very act of the truck getting stuck was the catalyst for choosing Porosenkov Log as the final resting place for most of the victims. But what of the other 2 bodies? In a move demonstrating a certain grim, criminal foresight, Yurovsky decides to separate 2 of the victims from the main group. His later accounts state that he took the bodies of Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, later identified through DNA as Maria, to a nearby spot, attempted to burn them more thoroughly on a separate pyre, and then buried their charred bone fragments in ashes. The likely reasoning for this separation was to confuse any future investigation. If a mass grave was discovered containing only 9 bodies, it wouldn't match the known number of 11 people who disappeared from the Ipatiev House. It's like he was thinking, if you're going to commit a massive historical crime that will echo through the ages, at least try to make the subsequent investigation really confusing for any pesky future historians or forensic scientists who might come sniffing around. By the early morning of July 19th, the terrible work is finally done. Yurovsky and his exhausted, traumatized men depart, leaving behind them two secret graves in the Ural wilderness. The Romanovs and those who died with them have vanished. For decades, their exact fate and resting place will remain one of Russia's most closely guarded secrets, a subject of rumor, speculation, and a deep, unhealed wound in the nation's psyche. Yurovsky believed he had succeeded in obliterating them from history. Time, however, would prove him wrong. Yakov Yurovsky and his commando had vanished into the chaos of revolutionary Russia, believing their gruesome task complete. The Romanovs and their memory supposedly obliterated beneath the mud and ashes of the Ural wilderness. But the earth, as they say, doesn't always keep its secrets. Just 8 days after the murders, on July 25th, 1918, the city of Ekaterinburg falls to the advancing anti-Bolshevik white forces, comprised mainly of the Czechoslovak Legion and elements of the Siberian Army. The Red Guards, Yurovsky included, have fled in haste. One of the first actions of the new white authorities is to launch an inquiry into the fate of the imperial family. Rumors are flying. Had they been spirited away by the Bolsheviks? Were some of them still alive? Initial investigations are somewhat haphazard, hampered by the ongoing civil war and the general confusion. But then, in February 1919, Admiral Alexander Kolchak, the leader of the white government in Omsk, appoints a dedicated and meticulous legal investigator named Nikolai Sokolov to take charge of the case. You now follow in Sokolov's determined footsteps as he begins the painstaking, grim work of uncovering the truth, or at least, as much of it as can be found amidst the debris of revolution and a deliberately obscured crime scene. Your first stop with Sokolov is the Ipatiev House, the house of special purpose. When Sokolov walked in, it wasn't exactly a pristine, untouched crime scene. More like revolutionary mayhem meets amateur Bolshevik cleanup crew attempt no. 1. He probably wished for a good UV light, a team of forensic specialists, and perhaps a whole season of CSI Ekaterinburg to help him sort through the lingering evidence. Despite the Bolsheviks' attempts to wash away the blood and remove incriminating signs, Sokolov, through careful examination, finds damning traces in that infamous semi-basement room. Bullet holes riddling the walls and floor, telltale slashes from bayonets, and subtle indications of bloodstains that even frantic scrubbing couldn't entirely erase. He interviews local residents, former servants of the Ipatiev House who hadn't been privy to the murders, but had observed the Romanovs' captivity, and even some captured Red Guards, piecing together a chilling narrative. But Sokolov's most significant and arduous work takes place at Ganina Yama, the abandoned For Brothers mine complex where Yurovsky had first attempted to dispose of the bodies. Guided by reports from local peasants who had seen smoke billowing from the area and noticed the tight Bolshevik cordon during those fateful July days, Sokolov and his team began a meticulous excavation. For weeks, they sift through the ashes, mud, and debris around the mine shafts. You can imagine this scene. Men carefully brushing away layers of earth, their faces grim as the story of those horrifying days begins to emerge, fragment by painful fragment. And the fragments they find are both poignant and irrefutable. There are remnants of burned clothing, clearly belonging to the imperial family. Dozens of corset busks, unmistakably from the undergarments of the Tsarina and the Grand Duchesses, are unearthed, a testament to their feminine presence even in this desolate place. They find a scattering of charred jewels and pearls, confirming the stories that the imperial women had sewn their valuables into their clothes. One of the most personal and heartbreaking discoveries is Dr. Botkin's upper set of false teeth. Finding Dr. Botkin's dentures amidst the ashes at Ganina Yama must have been a profoundly surreal moment for Sokolov. It's one of those stark, grimly specific personal details that screams something truly terrible and final happened to these individuals right here, but also with a touch of the absurdly tragic, and someone really, really missed their dental work in their last moments or shortly thereafter. Sokolov also uncovers small, calcined human bone fragments, tragically few, but definitely human. He finds bullets, casings, and the remnants of the large bonfires. Deep in one of a mine shaft, they discover the small, decomposing body of the Tsarevich Alexei's King Charles spaniel, Jimmy, apparently thrown down there by the killers. The evidence of the use of sulfuric acid is also clear. The sheer volume of material indicating a frantic, desperate attempt at cremation and destruction is overwhelming. Based on these extensive findings at Ganaina Yama and the relative scarcity of substantial human remains, Nikolai Sokolov reaches a definitive conclusion. The bodies of all 11 victims had been completely destroyed by fire and acid at this remote mine. He essentially reconstructs Yurovsky's initial and failed plan as the final act of disposal. He meticulously documents everything, taking photographs, drawing sketches, and collecting witness testimonies. What about Porosenkov log, the pig's meadow, where Yurovsky had actually buried 9 of the victims? Sokolov does investigate the area around railway crossing No. 184. He's aware of reports that the Bolshevik truck had gotten stuck there. He even finds some minor items dropped by the murderers. However, Yurovsky's desperate, last-minute plan to bury the bodies under the cart track itself, covering them with earth and railway ties, proves to be an effective deception. Sokolov and his men are literally walking over the main grave, but they don't dig there. Sokolov was so incredibly close to the real primary burial site at Porosenkov log. It's like one of those intensely frustrating video games where the ultimate treasure is just tantalizingly off-screen and your character walks right past it, completely oblivious. Yurovsky's impromptu hide the bodies under the road trick turned out to be a surprisingly effective, if macabre, bit of criminal landscaping that fooled investigators for decades. Historians still debate why Nikolai Sokolov, despite his renowned meticulousness and being so physically close to the Porosenkov log site, ultimately failed to discover the main grave, questioning whether it was solely due to the cleverness of the Bolshevik concealment or if other factors, like his limited time and resources, or perhaps a preconceived investigative focus on Ganaina Yama as the primary disposal site, also played a significant role. As the Russian Civil War turns against the Whites in late 1919 and 1920, Sokolov is forced to flee Siberia, retreating eastward with Admiral Kolchak's collapsing forces. Crucially, he carries with him the many boxes containing his invaluable investigation files, photographs, witness statements, diagrams, and the physical evidence, the corset pieces, the bullets, the jewels, Dr. Botkin's dentures. This is a truly remarkable historical fact. Nikolai Sokolov managed to transport this extensive collection of evidence out of revolutionary Russia across continents, eventually finding refuge in France. This act ensured the preservation of the primary evidence of the Romanov murders for future generations and for further analysis when political conditions might one day allow. Though Sokolov's investigation incorrectly identified the final method and location of the body's disposal, his work was foundational. He definitively proved that the entire imperial family and their attendants had been murdered in Ekaterinburg, and that a brutal attempt had been made to obliterate their remains. His meticulous report and the evidence he saved formed the bedrock of understanding in the West about the Romanov tragedy for over 70 years, keeping the truth alive while Soviet Russia descended into decades of denial and silence on the matter. While Nikolai Sokolov's meticulously gathered evidence began its long journey into the West, keeping a flicker of the horrific truth alive, a thick blanket of silence and obfuscation descended upon Soviet Russia regarding the fate of the Romanovs. You find yourself navigating decades where official pronouncements are few, carefully worded, and often deeply misleading. For many years, the accepted Soviet narrative, when they addressed the issue at all, was that Nicholas II, the hated tyrant, had indeed been executed in Ekaterinburg by order of the heroic Ural Regional Soviet, a necessary act to prevent his rescue by the advancing White armies. But the fate of his wife Alexandra and their 5 children? On this, the official Soviet line was a masterclass in what you might call Schrodinger's royals. They were simultaneously dead and possibly alive and well in an unspecified safe place, depending entirely on who was asking, what international treaty was being negotiated, and frankly, what year it happened to be. Very quantum, very convenient, and utterly infuriating for anyone seeking clarity. Why this prolonged secrecy, this deliberate ambiguity that lasted for more than 70 years? You can see several intertwined motivations. Firstly, there was the international image of the fledgling Soviet state. While executing a deposed autocratic czar could be framed as a revolutionary necessity, the cold-blooded killing of his wife and particularly his children was a far more problematic act, one that could and did invite international condemnation and complicate efforts to gain diplomatic recognition and trade agreements. Secondly, the Bolsheviks were wary of creating martyrs. A confirmed detailed account of the family's brutal end could fuel anti-Bolshevik sentiment both at home and abroad, providing the scattered white emigre movements with potent symbols of suffering and sacrifice. There might also have been internal party politics at play, perhaps a desire to shield top leaders like Lenin and Sverdlov from direct association with the more sordid details of the massacre, allowing the excesses to be vaguely blamed on the revolutionary zeal of local authorities or even, as some early Soviet accounts attempted, on left socialist revolutionaries or anarchists. And let's be honest, the chaotic, bungled, and frankly gruesome details of the body disposal at Gonina Yama and Porosenkov were hardly the stuff of heroic revolutionary legend. Meanwhile, in the West, Sokolov's findings, eventually published in book form in several languages, became the primary source of information. His detailed account, complete with photographs of the grim discoveries at Gonina Yama, directly contradicted any vague Soviet hints that members of the family might have survived. This Western narrative, however, coupled with the Soviet Union's determined silence about the children, created fertile ground for one of the most peculiar and persistent phenomena of the 20th century, the rise of the Romanov impostors. The vacuum of concrete information, especially concerning the children, was an open invitation for speculation and, for some, opportunistic deception. Of all the claimants who emerged, one figure stands out, capturing the world's imagination for decades: Anna Anderson. She surfaced in Berlin in the early 1920s, a young woman pulled from a canal after a suicide attempt, bearing scars she claimed were from Bolshevik bayonets and bullets. She eventually asserted that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna, the Tsar's youngest daughter, miraculously saved from the Ekaterinburg cellar. Anna Anderson's claim to be Anastasia was the 20th century's ultimate high-stakes, is it cake? Challenge, but with vast imperial fortunes potentially at stake and a whole lot more emotional and historical baggage. For decades, people passionately debated, is it truly Anastasia, or is it a remarkably convincing Polish factory worker named Franziska Tsarskoye with an uncanny memory, a network of well-meaning but perhaps misguided supporters, and a distinct flair for the dramatic? Anderson gained the support of some former Romanov relatives and courtiers, who were struck by her resemblance to Anastasia, her apparent knowledge of intimate family details, and perhaps by their own desperate hope. Others, including many closer Romanov family members like Anastasia's grandmother, the Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna, remained deeply skeptical or openly denounced her. Long and costly legal battles over her identity and potential inheritance rights dragged on for decades in German courts. While Anna Anderson was undoubtedly the most famous, you find records of others claiming to be Olga, Tatiana, Maria, or the Tsarevich Alexei, though none achieved her level of international notoriety or managed to sustain their claims for so long. The Soviet government, for its part, mostly ignored these imposter sagas, their silence only adding to the mystique. This official reticence inadvertently helped to build the enduring myth of the lost princess, Anastasia, a romantic and tragic figure who became a staple of books, plays, and films. The story of a surviving Romanov was simply too compelling for many to resist. Adding another layer to the enigma, in September 1977, the Ipatiev House itself was unceremoniously demolished. The order came directly from the Soviet Politburo in Moscow, and it was carried out by Boris Yeltsin, who was then the local Communist Party chief in Sverdlovsk, the Soviet name for Ekaterinburg. The official reason was urban redevelopment, but it was widely understood, both inside and outside the USSR, as an attempt to erase a site that was attracting far too much morbid curiosity and was becoming a sort of unofficial, unwanted shrine. The Soviets demolishing the Ipatiev House was rather like trying to unspill a massive historical coffee stain by simply bulldozing the entire antique carpet it had ruined. It didn't make the stain magically vanish. It just made everyone peer more intently at the bare floorboards and wonder even more fervently what precisely they were so desperate to hide under the new state-approved linoleum. A mainstream historical fact is indeed that demolition of the Ipatiev House in 1977, an act that, far from closing the book on the Romanovs, only deepened the public's fascination. Historians still debate the primary motivation behind the Politburo's decision. Was it a purely pragmatic, albeit clumsy, attempt to prevent the site from becoming a monarchist or religious pilgrimage destination? Or was it driven by a deeper, almost superstitious discomfort within the aging late Soviet establishment? A desire to physically erase a lingering symbol of a profoundly uncomfortable and bloody chapter in their revolutionary history? As the decades wore on, faint cracks began to appear in the official wall of Soviet silence, particularly during periods of political thaw. But the full, unvarnished truth about the events in that Ekaterinburg basement and the subsequent desperate efforts to hide the bodies remain a closely guarded state secret, a taboo subject, until the dying days of the Soviet Union itself, when the ghosts of the Romanovs would finally begin to speak from their long-hidden graves. The thick shroud of Soviet secrecy, which for over 70 years had enveloped the final resting place of the Romanovs, begins to fray as the winds of glasnost and perestroika sweep across the vast Soviet landscape in the late 1980s. The ghosts of the Ipatiev House, metaphorically silenced by official denial and the physical demolition of their last prison, are indeed about to speak, their voices carried not on the wind, but through the persistent curiosity and courage of a few determined individuals. You find yourself on the cusp of a discovery that will electrify Russia and the world. Your attention focuses on two men, Alexander Avdenin, a local geologist and amateur historian from Sverdlovsk, Ekaterinburg Soviet-era name, and Jelly Ryabov, a Moscow-based filmmaker and writer for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Both men harbored a deep, almost obsessive private interest in the Romanov case. They pore over available historical accounts, including smuggled copies or summaries of Sokolov's findings and, crucially, fragments or versions of Yakov Yurovsky's own secret report on the execution and burial, a document that had circulated quietly among some party officials over the decades. They become convinced that Sokolov was wrong about Gonina Yama being the final resting place, and that Yurovsky's account of a burial site near a railway crossing holds the key. Through the 1970s, while the Soviet Union under Brezhnev projected an image of monolithic stability, Avdenin and Ryabov embark on a clandestine search. Armed with Yurovsky's descriptions, they meticulously survey the area around a Koptyaki Road and Porosenkov log, the Pig's Meadow. Then, in the summer of 1979, a full 12 years before the official exhumation, their persistence pays off. You are there in spirit as they secretly, and with considerable personal risk, conduct a small exploratory dig at a spot that matches Yurovsky's clues. They unearth a few human skulls and bones. There is no doubt they have found a mass grave. Realizing the explosive, politically dangerous nature of their discovery in the still repressive Soviet climate, they make a difficult decision. They carefully rebury what they found, take meticulous notes and photographs of the location, and swear an oath of secrecy, waiting for a time when Russia might be ready to confront this dark chapter of its past. Avdenin and Ryabov, keeping the discovery of the Romanov grave secret for over a decade, must have been the ultimate, nerve-wracking exercise in maintaining a national-level poker face. Imagine going to dinner parties or work meetings. So, Alexander, anything particularly exciting happened to you lately? Oh, nothing much out of the ordinary. Just pinpointed the final resting place of Russia's last imperial family. The usual historical bombshell. How's your dacha progressing? The personal burden of such a secret must have been immense. The wait lasts until the Soviet system itself begins to visibly crumble. In 1_9_89, with Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost encouraging more openness about historical blank spots, Jelly Ryabov cautiously begins to break the silence. He publishes an article in the Soviet magazine Rodina, Motherland, hinting at the discovery. This is a mainstream historical fact that acted as the first public crack in the wall of official secrecy. Avdenin later publicly confirms their findings. The stage is set. In July 1991, as the authority of the Communist Party wanes and the Soviet Union heads towards its final collapse later that year, an official exhumation begins at Poroshenkovlog. You witness a scene of intense activity. Forensic experts, archaeologists, government officials, and the watchful eyes of the Russian and international press converge on this muddy, unassuming patch of ground. The 1991 exhumation at Pigs Meadow was like history's most macabre and politically charged archaeological dig, except instead of hoping to find ancient pottery or a forgotten king's tomb, they were quite literally hoping to unearth Russia's last Tsar, his entire family, and their loyal retainers. Talk about high-stakes historical and forensic paleontology. The excavation soon confirms Avdenin and Ryabov's secret discovery. In a shallow, hastily dug grave, measuring roughly 2 by 3 meters, jumbled together, lie the skeletal remains of 9 individuals. The scene is grimly consistent with Yurovsky's account of the main burial. There's evidence of the haste and brutality of the original interment, skulls bearing a telltale circular damage of gunshot wounds, bones stained greenish from the corrosive effects of sulfuric acid. Investigators also find bullets of various calibers, lead seals, fragments of rope, and significantly, shards of ceramic jars, the containers that once held the acid Yurovsky had ordered poured over the bodies. The initial wave of excitement and tentative confirmation, however, is immediately followed by a significant and perplexing question. There are only 9 skeletons. 11 people were murdered in the Ipatiev House basement. The remains of Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, Yurovsky's account pointed to Maria, though initial speculation often focused on Anastasia, are missing from this grave. This discovery, or rather lack thereof, sends a fresh ripple of confusion and controversy through Russia and among Romanov enthusiasts worldwide. Discovering only 9 bodies when everyone was expecting 11 was history's way of saying, plot twist. You thought this mystery was neatly solved? Think again, comrades. It was almost as if the universe, with a dark sense of humor, really wanted to keep that persistent Anastasia myth alive and kicking for just a little while longer, just for dramatic kicks. The political turmoil of the summer and autumn of 1991, the failed hardline coup in Moscow in August, the subsequent disintegration of Soviet power forms a chaotic backdrop to these initial findings. Skepticism arises in some quarters. The Russian Orthodox Church abroad, historically deeply suspicious of Soviet authorities, expresses doubts. Some Romanov descendants also voice reservations. Were these truly the remains of the imperial family? And if so, where were the other 2 children? Historians and forensic scientists continue to analyze the decision-making process of Avdenin and Ryabov back in 1979, debating the precise reasons they chose to rebury the remains and maintain their silence for over a decade, and whether an earlier, perhaps more officially sanctioned disclosure during a less turbulent political period might have altered the course of the investigation or the initial preservation and handling of the immensely sensitive site. The bones of contention, unearthed from the Siberian soil, now pose a new set of challenges. The mystery of the Romanovs is far from over. In fact, it has just entered a new scientific phase, one that will require cutting-edge forensic techniques to unravel the final truths hidden within these long-lost remains. The discovery of 9 skeletons in the shallow grave at Porosenkov in 1991 ignited a firestorm of questions, but it also heralded a new phase in the Romanov saga, the scientific quest for definitive identification. You now move from the muddy fields of Siberia into the sterile environment of laboratories, where Russian forensic experts, working in collaboration with leading international scientists from the UK and the USA, begin the painstaking task of making these long silent bones tell their story. Using DNA to identify the Romanovs was like history's ultimate, most macabre paternity test, except it was for an entire murdered dynasty, and the stakes were the truth of a century-old tragedy. Suddenly, royal family trees weren't just for dusty archives and enthusiastic genealogists. They were critical roadmaps for geneticists armed with really good pipettes and sophisticated sequencing machines. The initial anthropological examination of the 9 remains provided strong clues. Scientists could determine age, sex, and even some physical characteristics. They noted evidence of dental work consistent with the imperial family's access to good dentistry and signs of trauma like gunshot wounds and bayonet marks. But to achieve absolute certainty, they turned to the revolutionary technology of DNA analysis. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is passed down relatively unchanged through the maternal line, was particularly crucial. The challenge was obtaining reliable comparative samples. For Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna and her children, scientists turned to a living relative who shared their maternal lineage, Britain's Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. As a grandnephew of Alexandra, his maternal grandmother, Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, was Alexandra's older sister. He provided a blood sample, a mainstream historical fact that became a key link in the chain of identification. His mtDNA matched the mtDNA extracted from the remains of the adult female skeleton believed to be Alexandra and the 3 younger female skeletons found in the 1991 grave. Identifying Tsar Nicholas II proved more complex. While mtDNA could be traced through his maternal line, a peculiarity in his own mtDNA, a condition called heteroplasmy, where an individual has more than one type of mtDNA, initially caused some confusion. To resolve this, a bold step was taken: the exhumation of the remains of Nicholas's younger brother, Grand Duke George Alexandrovich, who had died of tuberculosis in 1899 and was buried in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Grand Duke George's DNA showed the same rare heteroplasmy, providing a crucial confirmation. Further comparative samples from descendants of Nicholas's sisters also helped solidify the identification of the Tsar. Between 1993 and 1994, the initial stunning results were announced. The 9 skeletons were indeed those of Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, at the time identified as Olga, Tatiana, and significantly for many Anastasia, and their 4 loyal attendants, Dr. Botkin, Anna Demidova, Ivan Karatinov, and Alexei Trupp. The world finally had scientific confirmation of the Ekaterinburg massacre. This scientific breakthrough also delivered the final, definitive verdict on the decades-long mystery of Anna Anderson. During her lifetime, she had steadfastly refused to provide blood samples for comparison. However, tissue samples preserved from a surgical procedure she underwent in a Virginia hospital years before her death in 1984 were located. DNA extracted from these tissues was compared to the Romanov DNA and also to DNA from living relatives of Franziska Tsarskoye, the Polish factory worker many believed Anderson to be. The results were unequivocal. Anna Anderson's DNA matched that of the Tsarskoye family. She bore no genetic relation whatsoever to the Romanovs. For Anna Anderson, the DNA testing was the final, unappealable curtain call on her long-running, internationally captivating Anastasia Act. Science, with its cold, hard genetic facts, essentially announced to the world Sorry, love, the results are in, and you're definitively more Polish factory worker than Russian Grand Duchess. Next contestant, please. The most famous Romanov impostor was an impostor indeed. Yet the mystery wasn't entirely solved. Two Romanov children were still missing from the Porosenkov log grave, Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, the one not among the three identified from the first grave. This gap continued to fuel speculation and, for some, a lingering hope or doubt. Yurovsky's account had mentioned burning two bodies separately. Could they still be found? Local amateur historians and researchers in Ekaterinburg, inspired by these new scientific certainties and armed with Yurovsky's detailed descriptions, continued to search the area around Porosenkov log. And then, in the summer of 2007, another astonishing discovery was made. In a separate, smaller pit not far from the main grave, they found a collection of severely burned and fragmented human bone remains, along with nails, pieces of wood from a box, and ceramic shards consistent with sulfuric acid containers. There were remains of two young individuals. When Alexei and Maria's remains were finally unearthed in 2007, it was as if the universe, or perhaps just persistent local archaeology, had finally decided to give historians and the Romanov family a much-needed break. Okay, history seemed to sigh. You've all suffered enough with the nine-body mystery and the endless Anastasia debates. Here are the other two. Now can we all finally agree they're well and truly dead, and Yurovsky wasn't just making up stories about a separate fire? Again, international teams of geneticists went to work. And in 2008 and 2009, after extensive and complex DNA testing on these charred fragments, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The remains were confirmed to be those of Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich and one of his sisters, Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna. The initial identification of Anastasia in the first grave was revised based on more refined skeletal analysis and the completeness of the family group now. This finding perfectly matched Yurovsky's grim account of separating and attempting to completely destroy two of the bodies to confuse any potential discovery. While the overwhelming scientific consensus from multiple independent laboratories around the world confirmed all these DNA identifications, a small but sometimes vocal minority, particularly within certain conservative circles of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, Rosser, continued for some time to express skepticism or call for further verification, debating the chain of custody of various samples or the precise interpretation of some of the early genetic results. This illustrated the deep emotional and spiritual complexities the Romanov case still held. Nevertheless, for the vast majority of historians and scientists, the case was closed. After nearly a century of mystery, myth, and heartbreaking uncertainty, science had provided definitive answers. The fate of Russia's last imperial family, and those who chose to die with them, was no longer a matter of speculation but of established, genetically verified fact. The scientific pronouncements of the 1990s and 2000s, confirming the identities of all 11 victims from the Ipatiev House, might seem like the final chapter in the Romanov tragedy. Yet, as you've seen throughout this long, dark journey, the story of Russia's last imperial family is never quite that simple. The legacy of their lives, and particularly their brutal deaths, continues to resonate, to provoke debate, and to shape how Russia views its own tumultuous past. On July 17, 1998, 80 years to the day after their murder, a solemn and deeply symbolic event takes place in St. Petersburg. The remains of Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, three of their daughters, Olga, Tatiana, and as then identified through the initial DNA work, Anastasia, along with Dr. Eugene Botkin and their three loyal servants, Ivan Karatanov, Alexei Trupp, and Anna Demidova, are interred in the St. Catherine Chapel of the Peter and Paul Cathedral. This cathedral, the traditional resting place of Russian emperors since Peter the Great, now receives these long-lost members of the dynasty. It's like history's most tragically delayed RSVP, but the occasion is marked with a gravity it deserves. A mainstream historical fact is that then Russian President Boris Yeltsin attended the ceremony, and in a striking speech, he didn't mince words, calling the murders one of the most shameful pages in our history and urging the nation towards repentance and reconciliation. For many, it felt like a pivotal moment, an attempt by the new Russia to confront and atone for the crimes of its Soviet predecessor. The spiritual dimension of their legacy also takes concrete form. In 1981, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, Rosser, which had long viewed the Bolshevik regime with hostility, canonized the entire imperial family as martyrs. Back in Russia, after the fall of communism, the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church followed suit in 2000, though with a nuanced distinction. Nicholas, Alexandra, Alexei, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia were canonized not strictly as martyrs for their faith, but as passion bearers, strastoterpsy. This term denotes those who face suffering and death with Christian meekness and forgiveness, akin to Christ's passion. It was a way to honor their piety and suffering without necessarily endorsing Nicholas II's controversial political reign. The Romanovs going from being officially reviled as enemies of the people to being venerated as saints by the national church is quite the posthumous career trajectory. It just goes to show, in Russia perhaps more than anywhere, history is not merely the past. It's an ongoing, often contentious performance review with profound contemporary implications. Scholars and religious figures continue to debate the precise theological and political implications of this canonization, particularly the distinction between martyr and passion bearer, and how Nicholas II often criticized leadership and the bloody events of his reign should be reconciled with his now sacred status within the Church. But even as 9 members of the family found their final resting place, the story of the remains wasn't fully concluded. You'll recall that the severely burned and fragmented remains of Tsarevich Alexei and Grand Duchess Maria were only discovered in 2007, their identities confirmed by DNA shortly thereafter. Yet, as of today, these 2 children, the last to be found, have still not been buried alongside their parents and sisters in the Peter and Paul Cathedral. Their remains are currently held in a Russian state archive. The Russian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, while acknowledging the scientific evidence, has maintained a cautious stance, requesting further investigations and verification to alleviate any lingering doubts before proceeding with a full religious burial. This ongoing situation, with Alexei and Maria's bones waiting in a kind of limbo while everyone agrees on the final hows, wheres, and whys of their interment, feels like the final, almost bureaucratic cliffhanger in the long Romanov saga. You just want to shout with a degree of respectful exasperation, "Folks, science has spoken repeatedly. Can these poor children please finally rest in peace with their family?" So, what is the lasting impact of this century-old tragedy? It signifies, most obviously, the brutal and definitive end of a 300-year-old dynasty, the turning point that reshaped Russia and the world. The murders themselves became a potent and enduring symbol of the terrifying inhumanity that revolutionary fervor can unleash, a cautionary tale written in blood. The decades-long search for truth, from Sokolov's determined efforts in the midst of civil war to the clandestine searches by Abdinin and Ryabov, and finally to the meticulous work of international teams of scientists, highlights a profound human need for historical justice and factual clarity, however delayed. And, of course, it's a powerful testament to the role of science, particularly forensic DNA analysis, in cutting through layers of myth, political expediency, and deliberate obfuscation to arrive at verifiable truth. In modern Russia, the Romanovs evoke a complex tapestry of emotions and interpretations. For some, they are primarily tragic victims, symbols of a lost, perhaps idealized, Imperial Russia. For Orthodox believers, they are saints, intercessors in heaven. For others, particularly those who still view the Soviet period through a more positive lens, Nicholas II remains the bloody Nicholas, the inept autocrat whose failures precipitated revolution. The construction of the magnificent church on the blood on the very site where the Ipatiev House once stood in Ekaterinburg serves as a focal point for commemoration and pilgrimage, a physical manifestation of this complex remembering. As you reflect on this long and often harrowing journey, several questions might linger in your mind, questions that perhaps every society must grapple with when confronting its own difficult past. How does a nation truly come to terms with such traumatic, foundational events? Can scientific proof ever provide complete closure when such deep political, emotional, and religious currents are still swirling? And what is our enduring global fascination with the Romanovs, their opulence, their fall, their tragic end, and the long mystery that followed? Tell us about our collective relationship with history, with the allure of royalty, and with a profound human response to tragedy on an epic scale. The answers, like the Romanov story itself, are likely to remain complex and open to continued contemplation. The lights in the Ipatiev House basement have long been extinguished, the echoes of gunfire have faded into the annals of a turbulent century, and the frantic efforts to erase a family from history have, ultimately, been answered by the quiet persistence of truth seekers and the unerring voice of science. As our journey through this profound Russian tragedy draws to a close, you might feel the weight of the events we've traversed, the opulence and the agony, the whispered conspiracies, and the stark, undeniable facts. The story of the Romanovs is one of immense historical significance, a poignant reminder of how swiftly worlds can crumble and how enduring this search for understanding can be. Allow the details to soften now, the sharp edges of the narrative to blur. The chilling winds of the Urals, the scent of pine and damp earth around those hidden graves, the sterile quiet of laboratories where identities were painstakingly pieced together. Let these sensations recede, replaced by a sense of quiet contemplation. The finality of their fate, once shrouded in rumor and deliberate obscurity, has been laid bare, not for judgment, perhaps, but for remembrance. The quest for certainty regarding the Romanovs took decades, a testament to both the depths of the initial crime and the human desire for closure. As you prepare to drift into your own peaceful rest, carry with you not the horror, but the quiet dignity that often emerges in tales of profound loss, and the reassuring knowledge that even secrets buried deep beneath the earth or obscured by time and turmoil can eventually be brought into the light. The night is calm now. The whispers of history are quieting. Rest